As of April 7, 2026, the United States and Iran are now in the 38th day of active military conflict. The war began on February 28th, when American and Israeli forces launched nearly 900 strikes within the first 12 hours of an operation the Pentagon named Operation Epic Fury. These strikes targeted Iranian military infrastructure, nuclear facilities, and senior leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed alongside the Minister of Defense and the commander of the Revolutionary Guard. Iranian state media initially denied Khamenei's death, but later confirmed it. He was 86 years old and had reportedly been battling prostate cancer. According to Iranian state outlets, he was offered refuge in Moscow, which he refused. Iranian officials framed his death as a deliberate act of martyrdom. If you're learning something here, please hit subscribe. Many of you know what's been happening with the channel, and if you wish to support, a link is in the description. I've spent months researching what lies ahead between 2026 and 2030 and compiled it all into an ebook called The Next Global Shift: How to Stay Ahead of Economic Collapse and War, covering economies, conflicts, and the strategic moves you need to make. Links are in the description. Now let's dive into the video. Understanding Iran's response requires seeing the Shia faith as a strategic factor, not just a religious one. Shia Muslims have historically been a minority within the broader Muslim world, and their theological tradition emphasizes martyrdom and self-sacrifice as acts of collective meaning and resistance. Within that framework, Khamenei's death did not operate as a decapitation of leadership. It acted as a call to total war. Iranian commanders announced decentralized command across all regions, meaning that neutralizing Tehran would not halt military operations elsewhere in the country. The United States and Israel presented the opening strikes as a targeted, limited mission. Iran responded by declaring the Strait of Hormuz closed on March 4th when a Revolutionary Guard commander broadcast a warning over international maritime radio frequencies, stating any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. From that point, vessel tracking services showed tanker traffic in the strait had effectively stopped, with limited movement only among Iranian and Chinese-flagged ships. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, serves as the main maritime corridor for roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade, about 20 million barrels per day. The closure triggered the largest energy supply disruption since the 1973 oil crisis, according to the International Energy Agency. By March 8th, Brent crude had surpassed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years, peaking at $126 per barrel. By March 31st, the national average for retail gasoline in the United States had reached $4 per gallon, a 30% increase since the war began. Diesel fuel hit $5.62 per gallon by early April, up nearly 50% since February. In California, the average gas price recorded on April 6th was $5.87 per gallon. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published analysis estimating that a full quarter closure of the strait, removing close to 20% of global oil supplies, would raise the average West Texas intermediate oil price to $98 per barrel and reduce global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points for that quarter. Bloomberg Economics projected that at 170 per barrel, the combined inflationary and contractionary effect would roughly double, constituting what the firm described as a stagflationary shock. Separately, analysts at Goldman Sachs estimated that the initial conflict risk premium had added roughly $14 per barrel to oil prices as of early March. Beyond oil, the closure of the strait produced cascading effects across multiple commodity categories. Qatar, which supplies roughly 20% of global liquefied natural gas, declared force majeure on all export contracts after Qatar Energy confirmed that tankers could not leave the Gulf. The company later disclosed that missile damage to its largest LNG facility would take up to 5 years to repair. Gulf Cooperation Council states, which import approximately 80% of their food through the strait, experienced a grocery supply crisis by mid-March. Roughly 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, and consumer prices in those markets rose between 40% and 120%, according to reporting at the time. Iranian strikes on desalination infrastructure in Kuwait and Qatar, which supply 99% of drinking water in those countries, pushed the crisis from an economic emergency toward a potential humanitarian one. Iran's attacks on neighboring Gulf states also targeted American military bases throughout the region. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, sustained strikes. American bases in Qatar, Kuwait, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates were also hit. On March 19th, the United States launched a military campaign specifically aimed at reopening the strait by force. By late March, the U.S. had deployed more B-1 bombers to a single base than at any point in the post-Cold War era. According to the Atlantic Council's Forward Defense Tracker, the Atlantic Council also estimated that between 63% and 71% of all available E-3 AWACS surveillance aircraft were committed to the operation. The tracker noted that this level of commitment was straining military assets in ways that could affect American deterrence capacity in other theaters, particularly in Asia. Iran's primary offensive tool throughout the conflict has been its drone arsenal. The Shahed drone costs between $35,000 and $50,000 per unit. Iran was estimated to be producing several hundred per day, with a stockpile of approximately $80,000 at the time the war began. American and allied air defense systems, including THAAD interceptors, cost roughly $1 million per missile and typically require multiple missiles per drone engagement. This asymmetric cost ratio has remained a defining feature of the conflict's military economics. On the diplomatic front, ceasefire negotiations have proceeded through a series of indirect channels. Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt have served as the primary mediators, with Pakistan's army chief, Field Marshal Amir, leading the most active back channel. As of April 6th, a proposed 45-day ceasefire framework had been drafted by mediators and shared with both Washington and Tehran, calling for a temporary halt to hostilities, followed by negotiations toward a permanent settlement. The proposal identified two central issues requiring a final rather than interim resolution: the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and the disposition of Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Iran publicly rejected the temporary ceasefire framing. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ezil Bagai stated that a pause would only allow adversaries to prepare for a continuation of the war. Iran's stated position is that it will negotiate a permanent end to the war, not a suspension of it. Iran transmitted a 10-point response to Washington through Pakistan, which included provisions for safe passage through the strait, reconstruction commitments, and the lifting of sanctions. President Trump, speaking to reporters on April 6th, described the proposal as a significant step but said it was not sufficient. He reiterated a threat to strike Iranian energy and transportation infrastructure, including power plants and bridges, by Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time if the strait was not reopened. The IAEA issued a statement on April 6th warning that ongoing military activity near Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant could cause a severe radiological accident with potential consequences extending beyond Iran's borders. The plant had been struck 4 times since the conflict began. Israel also struck Iran's South Pars petrochemical complex during the same period. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz confirmed the strikes, stating that the Jam and Damavan petrochemical facilities, which account for roughly 85% of Iran's petrochemical exports, had been rendered inoperative. On the Lebanon front, Israel authorized a ground incursion in early March and continued conducting airstrikes. More than 1,497 people have been killed in Lebanon since the war expanded to that front. The Houthis resumed ballistic missile and drone strikes on Israel on March 28th, opening an additional front in the conflict. The war's financial effects have extended well beyond energy markets. The 30-year mortgage rate in the United States climbed to 6.38% by late March. The 10-year Treasury bond yield jumped to 4.46% on March 27th, its highest level since July 2025. A Financial Times investigation reported that $580 million in short positions on oil had been placed roughly 15 minutes before Trump posted a statement on March 23rd, announcing a postponement of attacks on Iran, briefly sending oil prices lower. The report prompted calls for a formal investigation into potential insider trading. Gulf Cooperation Council sovereign wealth funds, which had been increasing their investments in American financial markets over the prior decade, are now diverting capital toward domestic defense and survival spending. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted separately that the war was disrupting global agriculture markets due to the Gulf region's role in fertilizer production. Gulf states account for roughly 45% of global sulfur supply, a key input in fertilizer manufacturing. Geopolitical analyst Marco Papik of BCA Research estimated in late March that the conflict had removed between 4.5 and 5 million barrels per day from global supply, amounting to roughly 5% of global output. He projected that figure would double by mid-April, representing the single largest loss of crude supply ever recorded. On the question of how long the strait disruption can be absorbed before permanent economic damage sets in, oil industry executives and analysts have consistently pointed to mid-April as a threshold beyond which supply disruptions are expected to significantly worsen and become harder to reverse, even if a settlement is reached. The U.S. Energy Information Administration projected in late March that crude oil prices could push retail gas prices approximately 7 cents per gallon higher in the second quarter of 2026 before returning toward $3 by year's end, contingent on conditions in the Strait improving. As of April 6th, those conditions had not improved. The EIA also noted that Trump had ordered the release of 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in early March, an action that would take approximately 120 days to fully deliver to the market. The International Energy Agency coordinated an emergency release that analysts at Morgan Stanley estimated at roughly 2 million barrels per day. The U.S. Energy Secretary indicated the actual figure could reach 3 million barrels per day, though the precise release rate remained unclear at the time of reporting. South Korea, which imports approximately 75% of its oil through the strait, has been identified by CSIS analysts as the non-combatant country most severely affected by the conflict. 1 month in, facing both economic pressure and domestic political consequences, Japan's prime minister publicly warned that a sustained strait closure could exhaust the country's oil supply within roughly 8 to 9 months. China, which receives approximately a third of its oil via the strait, had built up a reserve of roughly 1 billion barrels, providing a buffer measured in months rather than indefinitely. As of April 6th, the immediate question before both parties is whether the 45-day ceasefire framework proposed by mediators can be accepted in the hours before Trump's stated deadline expires. The broader question, which analysts have been addressing throughout the conflict, is whether the structural conditions of the war allow for a durable settlement at all. Iran has identified its enriched uranium stockpile and its leverage over the strait as its primary negotiating assets, and has stated it will not relinquish either in exchange for a temporary pause. The United States has stated that both issues must be addressed as preconditions. The gap between these positions as of today has not been closed. This is the video for today. If you want my ebook, the link is in the description. See you later.